September 20th, 1863, Northwest Georgia. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. Major General William Rosecrans stood frozen, watching his army collapse before his eyes. Half his line had shattered. Thousands of soldiers were fleeing in panic toward Chattanooga. Beside him, his commanders were shouting, urging him to run. The battle was lost. Everyone could see it. Everyone except one man. General George Thomas stood on a ridge called Horseshoe, his uniform caked in dirt and blood. Around him, the remnants of broken divisions scrambled for safety. But Thomas wasn't running. He was digging in. While his commanding officer fled and his fellow generals abandoned the field, Thomas made a choice that would earn him the scorn of his peers and the fury of his men. He ordered them to stay, to hold the line, to retreat slowly, deliberately, under withering fire. They called it cowardice, a death sentence disguised as orders. But that controlled retreat, that refusal to run when every instinct screamed to flee, wasn't surrender. It was something far more dangerous. It was the beginning of a counterattack that would change the course of the Civil War. Why running away sometimes means running toward victory. To understand what Thomas did at Chickamauga, you have to understand what retreat meant in 1863. In the culture of military honor that defined the Civil War, retreating was shameful. Generals were expected to hold their ground or die trying. To give up territory was to admit defeat. To order your men backward while the enemy pressed forward was seen as weakness, incompetence, or worse. The Confederate cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest had once declared that wars were won by those who got there firstest with the mostest. The implication was clear. Aggression won battles. Forward momentum determined victory. Retreat was for losers. But George Thomas understood something his contemporaries didn't. Sometimes losing ground slowly was smarter than losing an army quickly. The Battle of Chickamauga had started 2 days earlier, when Union and Confederate forces clashed in dense forests near Chickamauga Creek. Rosecrans had pushed the Confederate Army of Tennessee out of Chattanooga weeks before, and Confederate General Braxton Bragg was determined to take it back. On that morning of September 20th, everything went catastrophically wrong for the Union. Due to a miscommunication, Rosecrans had ordered one of his divisions to move, creating a gap in the Union line. By cruel coincidence, Confederate General James Longstreet launched his attack at precisely that moment, driving 8 brigades straight through the opening like a spear through paper. The Union right flank disintegrated. Entire divisions scattered in panic. Rosecrans himself, along with 2 of his corps commanders, fled the field, racing toward Chattanooga, convinced the battle was over. Private Daniel McCook of the 52nd Ohio later wrote in his diary, "We ran like rabbits, officers screaming, men throwing down rifles, artillery abandoned. I thought we were all going to die." But on the Union left, Thomas received the news and made his decision. He would not run. The general who refused to panic. Thomas was a Virginian who had chosen to fight for the Union, a decision that cost him his family and his home. He was methodical, calm under fire, and possessed an almost stubborn refusal to accept defeat. When messengers reached him with news that the right flank had collapsed and Rosecrans had fled, Thomas's response was simple. "Then we hold here." Horseshoe Ridge was not an ideal defensive position. It was just high ground in dense woods. But it was something. Thomas immediately began consolidating scattered units, pulling together fragments of broken brigades, rallying men who thought the day was lost. Captain Horace Porter of the Ordnance Corps later recalled, "Thomas moved among the men like a man walking through his garden. No panic, no shouting, just orders, calm, clear, impossible to ignore." But holding that ridge meant something that terrified his soldiers. It meant standing still while the enemy came at them. It meant watching the Confederates mass for attack after attack. It meant not running when every fiber of their being screamed to flee. Corporal James Fry wrote to his sister, "We thought the general had lost his mind. Staying meant dying. Everyone knew it." But Thomas wouldn't budge. Throughout the afternoon, Confederate forces launched wave after wave of assaults on Horseshoe Ridge. Longstreet himself pushed his exhausted troops forward, expecting the Union position to crumble. But Thomas's men held, not because they wanted to, not because they believed they could win, But because Thomas had convinced them that holding that ridge for just a few more hours would save the thousands of soldiers retreating toward Chattanooga. The retreat Thomas orchestrated wasn't a rout. It was controlled, disciplined, agonizingly slow. Units would fire, fall back 20 yards, reform, fire again. Officers kept their men in formation even as Confederate bullets tore through the trees. Artillery crews stayed at their guns until the last possible moment before limbering up and withdrawing. Lieutenant Colonel William Sanderson described it years later. "It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. Turning your back to the enemy, walking when you want to run, knowing they're coming." But Thomas never wavered, and somehow neither did we. The controlled chaos of saving an army. By nightfall, Thomas had held Horseshoe Ridge for 6 hours. 6 hours that allowed the rest of the Union Army to escape to Chattanooga. 6 hours that prevented the Confederate forces from pursuing and destroying Rosecrans's fleeing troops. 6 hours that turned a catastrophic defeat into something salvageable. As darkness fell, Thomas finally gave the order to withdraw. His men pulled back in good order, unit by unit, maintaining formation even in the dark. They left the battlefield to the Confederates, but they left as an army, not a mob. When Thomas reached Rossville that night, he found James Garfield, a Union officer and future president, waiting with a message from Rosecrans. The commanding general, safely ensconced in Chattanooga, had finally regained his composure enough to send orders. Garfield had ridden back to the battlefield to assess the situation. What he found amazed him. While Rosecrans had been convinced the army was destroyed, Thomas had saved it. Garfield sent a telegram to Rosecrans that would become famous. "Thomas is standing like a rock." But not everyone saw it that way. In the immediate aftermath of Chickamauga, the battle was recorded as a Confederate victory. The South had held the field. The North had retreated. By the standards of the day, that meant the South had won. Some Northern newspapers called the battle a disaster. Others questioned why Thomas hadn't pursued a more aggressive defense. A few whispered that if he had attacked instead of merely holding, perhaps the day could have been saved. Thomas's own men were conflicted. They had survived, but they had retreated. They had given up the battlefield. To soldiers raised on notions of honor and glory, that felt like failure. Sergeant William Thompson wrote, "We held our ground until ordered to fall back, but it still feels like we lost. The rebels have the field. How is that victory?" Meanwhile, in Chattanooga, Rosecrans's army huddled behind fortifications, besieged by Bragg's Confederate forces. Morale was low. Supplies were cut off. The situation looked grim. For weeks, it seemed like Thomas's retreat had merely delayed the inevitable. The Confederates had won Chickamauga, and now they would starve the Union Army into surrender. But then everything changed. When a retreat becomes a springboard. In October of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant arrived in Chattanooga with reinforcements. He took one look at the situation, relieved Rosecrans of command, and appointed George Thomas to lead the Army of the Cumberland. The man who had been criticized for retreating was now in charge of the entire army. Grant's plan was audacious. Rather than wait for the siege to slowly strangle them, he would attack. He would use Chattanooga as a base to launch a devastating counteroffensive against the very army that had beaten them at Chickamauga, and Thomas's forces would be at the center of it. The controlled retreat Thomas had orchestrated suddenly revealed its true genius. By saving the army intact, by maintaining unit cohesion and morale, by refusing to let panic turn defeat into annihilation, Thomas had preserved the fighting force that would now become the hammer that broke the Confederate siege. On November 23rd, the Battle of Chattanooga began. Thomas's troops moved first, seizing Orchard Knob in a preliminary assault. 2 days later, on November 25th, came the main event. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was ordered to advance on Missionary Ridge, the heavily fortified Confederate position overlooking the city. The plan called for a limited assault to take the rifle pits at the base of the ridge. But something extraordinary happened. Something that military historians still debate. After taking the first line of Confederate trenches, Thomas's men didn't stop. Without orders, Without permission, they kept going. They charged straight up the steep slopes of Missionary Ridge into the teeth of Confederate artillery and rifle fire. Grant, watching from Orchard Knob, was furious. He turned to Thomas and demanded to know who had ordered the advance. Thomas replied calmly, "I don't know. I did not." It was a spontaneous decision by the soldiers themselves, men who had been called cowards for retreating at Chickamauga. Now they were proving they hadn't retreated out of fear. They had retreated because their general had given them an order. And when that same general needed them to attack, they would go anywhere, do anything. The charge up Missionary Ridge became one of the most dramatic moments of the Civil War. Against all odds, Thomas's troops broke through the Confederate defenses, sent Bragg's army fleeing in disarray, and lifted the siege of Chattanooga. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, which had won at Chickamauga, was now shattered, its commander disgraced, its strategic position lost, and it all traced back to that retreat, that disciplined, controlled, maligned retreat that had saved the army and preserved it for this moment. Why history remembers the battle, not the retreat. After Chattanooga, George Thomas became a legend. The nickname that had started at Chickamauga, the Rock of Chickamauga, became a symbol of steadfast courage. He would go on to command in more battles, eventually winning one of the most decisive victories of the war at Nashville. But the story of his retreat faded into the background. When people remembered Chickamauga, they remembered the desperate stand on Horseshoe Ridge, the heroic defense, the refusal to break. They rarely remembered that Thomas had retreated, that he had given up the battlefield, that by conventional standards he had lost. And that's the point, because Thomas understood something that transcended conventional wisdom. He understood that the goal wasn't to hold ground. It was to preserve the ability to fight another day. The goal wasn't to win every engagement. It was to position your forces for the victories that mattered. In the months after Chattanooga, as the truth of what Thomas had done became clear, the criticism faded. Officers who had questioned his decisions now praised his judgment. Soldiers who had cursed him for making them retreat now credited him with saving their lives. Grant himself called Thomas one of the finest generals in the Federal Army. But Thomas never sought recognition. He destroyed most of his personal papers before his death, saying he didn't want his life hawked in print for the eyes of the curious. He didn't write memoirs defending his decisions. He simply did what he thought was right and let history judge. And history did judge, not immediately, not loudly, but eventually, military scholars began to recognize what Thomas had accomplished. His controlled retreat at Chickamauga became a case study in tactical withdrawal. His ability to maintain unit cohesion under catastrophic circumstances became a model for future commanders. The Confederate victory at Chickamauga, which had seemed so decisive at the time, was revealed to be hollow. Bragg had won the field but lost the war. Thomas had lost the field but saved the army that would ultimately win. The lesson we forget, again and again. When I first encountered the story of George Thomas and the retreat at Chickamauga, I thought it was just another Civil War battle, another story of brave men and tragic losses. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized it was something else entirely. It was a story about the difference between tactics and strategy, between winning a moment and positioning for a larger victory, between doing what looks heroic and doing what actually works. We live in a culture that valorizes aggression, forward momentum, refusing to back down. We celebrate the charge, the stand, the refusal to retreat. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is fall back, regroup, preserve your resources, wait for the right moment. Thomas's retreat wasn't cowardice. It was patience weaponized. Think about the systems we operate in today. How often do we double down on losing positions because we're afraid of looking weak? How often do we waste resources defending ground that doesn't matter? How often do we confuse stubbornness with strength? Thomas knew that holding Horseshoe Ridge wouldn't win the war, but he also knew that abandoning it in panic would lose it. So he held it long enough, just long enough, to preserve the possibility of future victory. That's not cowardice, that's wisdom. And it makes me wonder how many times in our own lives we face that same choice. The choice between defending a position because we're supposed to and recognizing when it's time to fall back, regroup, and prepare for a better opportunity. The choice between being seen as strong and actually being strategic. Maybe you're in a job that's grinding you down, but you're afraid to leave because it looks like giving up. Maybe you're in a relationship that's not working, but you're holding on because you don't want to admit defeat. Maybe you're pursuing a goal that no longer serves you, but you've invested so much that retreat feels impossible. Thomas teaches us that retreat isn't failure, it's repositioning. It's not about giving up, it's about giving yourself the chance to come back stronger. So, let me ask you this. What position are you defending that you should be retreating from? What ground are you holding that doesn't actually matter? And what would it take for you to make the hard, brave, strategic decision to fall back, preserve your strength, and wait for the moment when you can launch your own counterattack? Because sometimes the people who call your retreat cowardice are the ones who don't understand strategy. They see only the moment, not the larger pattern. They judge the tactic, not the outcome. And history proves them wrong. George Thomas retreated. And in retreating, he saved an army. And in saving that army, he won the war. That's not cowardice. That's genius. And maybe, just maybe, it's exactly what you need to do right now.